Shimon tried to make the distinction of the definition between non-proliferation and counter-proliferation. It reminds me of the discussions with the Palestinians about the nature of their state. Is it going to be demilitarized or non-militarized? And tens of hours were spent on these rhetorics. Since I'm a man and not a woman, I cannot focus on two things at the same time, so I will focus mainly on counter-proliferation, which is the military option, and I'll try to make, I would say, a more balanced assessment of what are the consequences of such a thing. And I'm saying more balanced because, at least in the Israeli media in the past few weeks, we could hear only explanations why any kind of military strike is going to be a crazy decision that should be dismissed or excluded from the very beginning. But before that, one thing about the political efforts, or if you want, about the non-proliferation as it is defined in this panel. I found myself saying more or less the same thing in the past 7 years. It doesn't necessarily mean that I'm right, but I think that the evidence shows that this is probably the only real way to achieve a successful political solution to the problem of Iran. And this is a US-Russia grand agreement, a grand deal that will definitely will need the United States to make some extraordinary concessions regarding other matters if the United States wants to bring Russia on board in the case of Iran. In other words, if the United States from time to time, or let's say now after this last report, will call the Russians and say, let's try to talk about Iran and see whether or not we can persuade you to take some other measures that so far you did not want to take, it is probably not going to succeed simply because the Iranian threat does not is not perceived to be so important for the Russians. And at the same time, the Russians are motivated not to help the Americans, but on the contrary, to try to harm the Americans whenever they can, simply because they perceive the American policy, whether it was the policy of Bush or the policy of Obama, as a policy that one of its main goals is to undermine the most sensitive and important interest of Russia. And as long as this is the perception in Moscow, there is very little hope that the Russians will join real effective sanctions against Iran. And of course, as long as the Russians don't do it, the Chinese will not do it. And as long as the Chinese don't do it, the Indians will not do it. So in a way, the attempt to isolate Iran is doomed to fail simply because the United States is not ready to discuss all relevant issues with Russia in a proper way, and as a part of such a potential deal, also to achieve something important vis-à-vis Iran, if it is, if this is the context of discussions between the United States and Russia, only to try to see what can be done in regard to Iran, and not to open it to some other matters like Ukraine, Georgia, Baltic states, and other things, as I said, it will fail. Let's try to speak about the, what are the implications or the consequences of the military option. And I think that before we go to real strategic decision, the political level in Israel has to ask the professional level four important questions. And only the answers to these questions can begin the discussion, not the public discussion, of course, but the real discussion within the Israeli cabinet. The first question is, what do we know about the locations of the important Iranian sites? In other words, are we confident with the intelligence that we have? Or as Donald Rumsfeld used to say, we know what we know, we don't know what we don't know. So to what extent we are confident with the first part, which is what we know. The second question, suppose we have a good answer to the first one, is can we bring a critical mass of sorties to the right targets in order to attack them in a, I would say, in an aggressive way. And this is, of course, a comparison between our ability to bring our offensive forces to this area vis-à-vis the Iranian abilities to defend themselves against such a thing. And of course, it does have also some kind of political consequences, because you have to fly somewhere in order to reach Iran, and what is possible, what is not possible. This is part of this second question. Can we bring enough critical mass of aircrafts to the right target? The third question, let's suppose that we give a positive or good answer to the second one. The third question is, what is going to be the physical damage that would occur to those targets? Are our bombs capable to penetrate the bunkers or the other places where the important stuff is stored? And what will be this physical damage? And let's assume that a reasonable answer is given to this question. We come to the fourth question, which is the most important one, and this is, and then what? What kind of delay would occur? Is it something that would cause a significant delay that can be measured in years? This is one answer. If it is something that can be measured in months, this is, of course, different answer. And it depends, of course, not only on the physical damage that would occur, but also a lot of other matters, what kind of knowledge exists in other places, how the important things are duplicated and kept in different places, etc. So a real professional discussions on this matter might give or should give the Israeli political leadership I would say the first and the most important first question, and this is the answer to the question whether or not there is a reasonable or reliable military option. Because if the answer is no, all the rest is almost irrelevant. Now, if the answer to these questions are yes, and if we continue and say that the Iranian threat is the biggest strategic threat to the state of Israel, some people say this is the existential threat to the state of Israel, of course it would be irresponsible to exclude the military option when it is available and when it can give answer to the most important threat that Israel faces. I'm not saying that it means that we have to use it, but at least we should not dismiss it and exclude it and say, whatever happens, we should never think about that. And then, of course, we have to discuss more the political matters, and this is something that we will have to compare between, I would say, not only the risks that are involved in such an attack, but also with the risks that might involve with the other option, which is probably to let Iran be nuclear power. And part of this discussion, of course, is not only what we believe and what we assess, but of course we have to talk to others. And naturally, the most important other is the United States. And here again, certain answer can end the discussion. Because if the President of the United States looks at the eyes of the Israeli Prime Minister and say to him in a very clear and explicit way, don't even think of that, then this is the end of the story. But I'm not sure that this is the American answer today. I'm definitely not sure that this will be the American answer, let's say, in more than a year. So the American answer to this question is crucial, but as I said, I'm not sure that it is as negative or explicitly negative as some people believe, but there is no doubt that this is an important question. So this is, I would say, the second phase after the military assessment. This is more the political assessment. And as I said, we will have to compare between two bad choices. And I believe that if not now, then within maybe a year, maybe 2 years, the government of Israel will face such a dilemma when a decision will have to be made. Or if you want, if we don't make a decision, you actually make a decision. And this is the need to make a decision between two terrible choices. Now, as I said, I'm not sure that the military strike is the best thing that we should dream about, and of course any other solution might be better. But let's say a few words about the consequences of a potential Israeli military strike against the Iranian nuclear facilities. And also I will divide it to the military consequences and to the more political or strategic ones. First, under the assumption that you do what you do before Iran has nuclear capabilities, of course the Iranian anticipated reaction is a conventional one. Now, does Iran or can Iran attack Israel as a retaliation and use its surface-to-surface missiles? The answer, of course, is yes. But naturally, because of the distance, the number of those potential missiles are not as big as even what we could see during the war, I would say, the Second Lebanese War. It is, by nature, the smaller number. Some of those missiles can be intercepted before they are launched, and some others can be intercepted later, and that's one of the reasons why we develop all those very expensive aero missile systems. So in the end of the day, a certain amount of explosive will fall in Israel, but if it is something so important and such an existential threat that you can remove, maybe it is something that you can tolerate, and you should not be that deterred that you cannot tolerate such a potential Iranian response. The second thing is Hezbollah. Many people say that if Israel attacks Iran, naturally Hezbollah will respond. It makes sense. But again, Hezbollah is a threat that, number one, can be exercised every day, regardless the Iranian case, because of Israeli-Lebanese tension. Number two, we already experienced something like this. It is not that pleasant, but again, I'm not sure that the state of Israel cannot cope with a problem that Hezbollah can present. In other words, this is something which is not pleasant, but not necessarily so destructive and so terrible that a state cannot afford. And so the immediate military consequences for such a thing is something that I believe the state of Israel can tolerate. And it brings me, of course, to the more political ones. And I would dare to say the following. No, there is nothing successful like success. If the Israeli strike is successful the way that it is perceived and presented, then all those who who are described as those who will be against Israel because Israel did something so terrible and Israel dragged the Middle East to such a new terrible and dangerous situation, and what might be the implications on the oil prices, etc. I'm not sure that they will say the very same things if and when there is an Israeli successful strike. I would dare to say that many of them, in a very, of course, confidential way, will applaud such a thing. And this is something that in a real long, I would say, strategic assessment, might give Israel much more than only the direct benefits of elimination or at least a delay of such an Iranian threat. In other words, I'm not saying that an Israeli military strike is something that has no risks, and I'm not saying that under any circumstances we should do it. But what I'm saying is that under certain circumstances, and if the military answer is a good one, and if the United States, for whatever reasons that could be, is not totally against it, it is something that should be considered very seriously, or at least have to be well prepared during these days. And for those who don't really know about that, a very similar discussion, and in this room there are people who know much more than me about that, a very similar discussions took place at least twice in the history of the State of Israel, back in '81, before the attack against the Iranian Iraqi reactor, and according to foreign sources, whatever Israel did in 2007, and there were concerns at that time. And I can tell you more than that. An attack against Syria at that time increased naturally the potential of a war between Israel and Syria. And we speak about proliferation here, and we refer only solely to nuclear threats. But everybody knows that Syria does have a very dangerous chemical weapons. And by attacking this site in Syria, we increase the possibility to be in war in Syria that might, in the end of the day, even lead to certain non-conventional attacks against the State of Israel. And still, as far as we understand, a real calculated and I would say courageous decision was made by those who were in charge at that time. And in retrospect, we can say about both cases, 81 and 2007, that not only Israel benefited from those decisions, but also the region and also beyond the region. The bottom line is that I believe that the international community will fail to reach a reasonable other solution to the Iran